One quiet night, a story begins in silence. But don't be quick to think everything will pass by quietly. Have you ever felt that sometimes life can change with just one small decision, one avoidable mistake? Surely you've found yourself in situations where everything seems to be going wrong, but all you can do is face it head on. Stay silent and listen to this story. Let me introduce our main character, Gloria Smith, a 56-year-old black woman, a nurse at a hospital in Savannah, Georgia. She has spent her life helping others, healing the unseen wounds. But tonight, everything will be different. This is not a normal night like every other. No shift to worry about, no patients to attend to, just her. A prescription in a small pharmacy at the corner of the street, the place where everything will change forever. Gloria walks into the pharmacy, her tired legs aching from long hours of work. She just wants to go home, rest and recharge after a long day. Nothing unusual here. But suddenly everything becomes abnormal. Just a glance, a fleeting suspicion, and the whole atmosphere shifts. Something is wrong, but you know this is no coincidence. This is prejudice, bias, something everyone can recognize, but not everyone dares to confront. Why her? Why a black woman standing alone in a small pharmacy on such a quiet night? These questions cannot be answered easily, but we can begin by listening to Gloria's story. We want to know where you are and what time it is. Leave a comment before the story starts, and don't miss the unexpected twists ahead. Stay tuned because this story is not just a case, it's a wake-up call. Secrets being revealed, and true, justice will come no matter how long it takes. Let's begin. Gloria Smith, 56 years old, is a nurse who has devoted 30 years of her life to the profession. She has endured countless emergency surgeries, cared for patients in pain, and faced challenges that not everyone could bear. But tonight, everything is different. After a long shift from morning until evening, Gloria only wants one thing: to pick up her prescription and go home to relax in the quiet space of her familiar room. The neighborhood where she lives seems peaceful, not noisy, not hurried. Gloria drives toward the pharmacy she has been visiting for years. She stops her car under the only flickering streetlight on the street. Her weary footsteps seem to have no strength left, but she still resolutely walks into the pharmacy. The faint yellow light shines from the window, and the atmosphere of the late night makes everything blurry, like an old movie. But something immediately makes her feel that something is wrong. There is only one young staff member in the pharmacy, a young man sitting behind the counter, absent-mindedly looking at his phone screen. Gloria smiles gently, familiar as usual, then hands over her documents and prescription. She doesn't pay much attention to the emptiness of the pharmacy or the strange silence in the space. She is too accustomed to nights like this. However, something unusual begins to creep into the atmosphere. The staff member stops typing on his phone, frowning as he looks at his computer screen, then turns to look at Gloria. He doesn't say anything, only staring at her identification on the paper with a somewhat tense gaze. Gloria quickly notices that something isn't right. A strange feeling invades her, a feeling she has been familiar with all her life. Whenever she steps into a space that isn't her own, that feeling is never wrong. It's discrimination, an indistinct but sharp suspicion, like a needle piercing her heart. The staff member immediately calls the manager. A middle-aged woman with a wrinkled face, seemingly displeased. Gloria can see that the manager's gaze is not one of curiosity, but of judgment. She is too familiar with that. Since she was a young girl, she had faced countless times with that gaze. A gaze full of prejudice. A gaze that said she didn't belong. A gaze that said she couldn't be part of this space just because of the color of her skin. That gaze has always been present, like a ghost following her every step. "Excuse me, ma'am, there is a problem with your prescription." The manager speaks, her voice sweet but cold, her eyes still fixed on Gloria. "The data doesn't match our system. I'm afraid we cannot fill your prescription tonight." Gloria looks at the manager calmly. She's used to situations like this, where small mistakes are often blown out of proportion. But this is the first time in all these years that she feels something particularly strange about this situation. She has been using the services of this pharmacy for years. Everything should be fine, but the manager's response doesn't reassure her. Gloria picks up the documents, moves closer, and explains carefully. "I've bought medicine here many times. Everything matches. Could you check again?" The manager skims through the papers, but it seems like she isn't even listening to Gloria's words. She simply looks back at Gloria with a cold gaze and speaks in an accusatory tone. "Sorry, but I can't process your prescription tonight. We've informed the authorities to check it." The manager's tone seems to grow harsher, and the eyes of the surrounding customers begin to focus on Gloria. She stands upright without any sign of panic. She has been through many bad things, but racial discrimination is something she's all too familiar with. She doesn't say anything, only clutching her prescription firmly in her hand and standing still waiting. But the feeling that something is wrong cannot be dismissed. Only a few minutes later, the door of the pharmacy suddenly opens and two police officers walk in. Both are men, both white officers. Gloria's feeling grows heavier. She is not someone who panics, but she knows this situation will not end well. The officers don't need to look at the papers. They just look at her, their eyes full of suspicion. Gloria knows she is being viewed as a criminal just because of the color of her skin, and tonight she will have to face it once more. This story is only just beginning, and the twist will soon come. These officers don't know who they're dealing with. Like everyone else, they think they can defeat Gloria, but they don't know that she never fights alone. The entire space in the pharmacy suddenly becomes heavy. The air feels stagnant. Gloria stands still, her hand still clutching the prescription, but inside an ominous feeling begins to spread. She can feel the staff member's gaze, a gaze that doesn't just stop at checking documents as usual. He doesn't just skim over the file, but seems to be searching for something else, something that Gloria can't see. Then he whispers to the manager, making the atmosphere even more tense. The manager walks over, her lips tightly pursed and her face expressionless. She glances at Gloria, her cold gaze as if she's already made a decision before speaking. Gloria feels like a cold wind has just swept through her soul. Everything suddenly becomes very vague, like a scene in a movie that doesn't belong to her. But Gloria has lived long enough to recognize that what's happening is not normal. "Sorry, ma'am, but there is a problem with your prescription." The manager says, her tone sweet but full of suspicion. "The information in the system doesn't match your documents. I'm afraid we cannot fill your prescription tonight." Gloria tries to remain calm. She has been using this pharmacy's services for many years, and there's no reason for something like this to happen. She knows that a small mistake like this can lead to unnecessary misunderstandings. In fact, it could be a careless data entry error. But when the manager continues to look at her with eyes as if she has committed some crime, Gloria can't help but feel she is being judged. "This can't be a mistake. I've been getting my medication here for years," Gloria says, her voice calm but firm. "The information in my documents matches. I request that you check again." But there was no change in the manager's attitude. She just frowned and pursed her lips. "I'm afraid there's nothing more we can do. We've reported it to the police for them to check." Her words struck Gloria like a knife to the heart. The police over a prescription with mismatched information. This was completely unreasonable. Gloria looked around and saw a few other customers in the pharmacy starting to look at her. Some of them didn't dare to look her directly in the eye, but their gazes were full of suspicion. That feeling was so familiar and uncomfortable. She knew that even if she hadn't done anything wrong, she would still be seen as suspicious simply because of the color of her skin. As if it were an automatic response, Gloria gripped her documents tightly in her hand, not allowing anyone to see the worry or confusion on her face. She stood firm, not leaving because she understood that if she walked away now, it would only provide more evidence for this baseless suspicion. She hadn't done anything wrong, and she wasn't going to let this doubt push her back. Soon the doorbell rang. Two police officers walked in. Both were men, both white officers, and both wore uncomfortable expressions, as if they had already decided she was a criminal the moment she stepped through the door. Their looks weren't curious, they were evaluative. They didn't need to see documents, didn't need evidence. They just looked at her and decided she was a suspect. The manager immediately walked over to the officers, her eyes gleaming with pleasure at having their help. "This is her," the manager said, her voice sounding urgent. "She's trying to get medication by deceiving the system. The information doesn't match. I suspect she's using fake insurance." Gloria felt anger welling up inside her, but she knew she couldn't react just yet. She stood tall, trying to remain calm. All her emotions, doubts and injustice boiled up inside her like a bundle of ropes tightening around her heart. She looked into the police officer's eyes without flinching. She knew that if she didn't stand firm right now, she would never be able to fight against this injustice. "Sorry, I haven't done anything wrong," Gloria said, her voice calm but firm. "You have the right to check my documents, but I have no reason to be treated like this." The chief officer, a tall man with a cold expression, stepped forward and spoke in a challenging tone. "You need to leave now or we will make things difficult for you." Gloria didn't move. She wasn't guilty, and she couldn't let herself be pushed into a difficult situation so easily. She kept her documents in hand, And before she could say another word, one of the officers moved closer. One of the officers grabbed her wrist quickly and pulled her outside. And in the midst of the silent crowd, Gloria only felt her body being shoved forward, but in her mind a fire was burning fiercely. This injustice would not stop with her. She knew that for sure. At that moment, everything seemed to slow down. The eyes that were staring at her, the people witnessing her being oppressed, Gloria no longer felt like a lone individual. She felt that something larger was happening. The people around her were witnessing an undeniable injustice, and whether the police wanted her to be silent or not, she had decided that tonight would not be an ordinary night. She had done something many people wouldn't dare to do. She wouldn't let them quietly erase the truth. The door of the pharmacy opened again, but this time it wasn't a customer entering. Two uniformed officers with strong and commanding presences walked in. One of them was the chief officer with a cold face and unflinching eyes. The other, seemingly younger, stepped back as though trying to maintain some distance, but didn't hide the discomfort that was clear in his gaze. Gloria immediately recognized that this wouldn't end here. Their footsteps on the tiled floor squeaked, as if threatening every step they took into her life. The strange feeling, a feeling she had been familiar with throughout her years of facing racism, rose strongly in her. It felt as though she had been caught, unable to escape, even though she had done nothing wrong. The chief officer walked straight toward her, his sharp gaze never leaving Gloria, as if she were a dangerous criminal. "You need to leave," he said, his voice hard and full of authority. "We will resolve this outside." Gloria stood her ground, her hands tightly clutching the documents she had provided. She hadn't done anything wrong, and there was no reason for her to leave quietly like this. She could feel the eyes of the people around her glued to her. They were looking at her, not as a normal person, but as a criminal they didn't know what to do with. Gloria couldn't let this continue. She needed to stand firm. "I haven't done anything wrong," she replied, her voice still calm but determined. "You can't force me to leave without a legitimate reason." But the chief officer had no intention of listening to her. He just skimmed through the papers she held in her hand without any trace of kindness or respect. He looked at her as though she was just a problem that needed to be dealt with quickly. "You need to leave right now," he continued without hesitation. "Don't make this difficult for us." Gloria didn't move. She stared straight at him, never breaking eye contact, her gaze filled with no fear. She didn't know if this was determination or rising anger inside her, but she knew her calmness wasn't weakness. While the space around her began to twist, darken, and grow tense, she stood firm like a rock that couldn't be pushed over. The younger officer, in an attempt to de-escalate the tension, stepped forward and gently patted the chief officer's shoulder. "She may not have done anything wrong, but we can't ignore the suspicion," he said, his voice a bit weak. However, the chief officer, having no intention of listening, turned to the younger officer and signaled for him to be quiet. He continued with his authoritative tone, controlling the situation without a proper explanation. Gloria could feel the blatant discrimination in their actions, as though, simply because of her skin color, everything would not be handled fairly. The gazes around her no longer appeared surprised. A few people had stood up, unsure of what to do. Some even turned their faces away, seemingly wanting no part in the incident. But there were others standing still, eyes fixed on her, unable to look away. They had seen everything, clearly witnessing what was happening. This wasn't a proper arrest, but an abuse of power. Gloria didn't look away, didn't move from her spot. "You can do whatever you want," she said softly but challengingly. "But I'm not going anywhere. You have no right to take me away just because you suspect me." Gloria's words rang out like a strong declaration in the tense space. Both officers fell silent for a moment, but neither of them backed down. The chief officer finally made a move, stepping forward and placing his hand on Gloria's arm, as if intending to drag her outside by force. Gloria felt discomfort when his hand touched her arm, but instead of resisting, she held her position. Not wavering, she didn't want to react aggressively, but she wouldn't allow herself to be violated further. When his hand gripped her wrist firmly, Gloria didn't look at him, but instead looked out the window. She saw people standing outside and all their gazes fixed on her. She knew that if she let this pass without standing up, things would only get worse. So while the chief officer continued to drag her outside, Gloria silently thought, no matter what, she wouldn't let them treat her like a criminal again. She wouldn't let racism turn her into an innocent person, oppressed by it. An invisible fear filled the air. But for Gloria, this was a defining moment. Things would never be the same again. Though a wave of anger was rising within Gloria, she didn't resist. The cold handcuffs tightened around her wrists, painful, but also a sign of the resilience she was maintaining. This feeling, though painful, made her more alert than ever. She could clearly feel their coldness, but at the same time she felt a slow burning fire igniting within her. The door of the pharmacy opened again this time, not because someone was entering, but because she was being shoved outside. One of the officers held her hand roughly, forcing her to walk toward the patrol car parked on the side of the road. With each step, the cuffs tightened around her wrists, aching with every heartbeat. She didn't look at them, didn't look into the eyes staring at her. The eyes not just of the people around her, but also of the very officers, the ones she once thought would protect justice. She knew that perhaps in this moment they thought they had everything under control, that they would easily treat her like an ordinary criminal. But she, Gloria Smith, the woman who had spent her life saving the sick, was not a criminal. She was a strong person, unwilling to let anyone strip her dignity, no matter what was happening. When they shoved her into the car, Gloria didn't show any signs of worry or fear. On the contrary, inside her, a steely determination began to form. "I won't let them destroy me," she thought. "I won't let them think they can do anything to me without facing consequences." The patrol car began moving, the sound of the tires on the road creating a strange fluctuating hum. Facing her were two officers, Rick and David, who didn't look at her but chatted indifferently. They joked about other cases as if she were just a burden they had to deal with. But inside her, their indifference was nothing more than a facade to cover up the anger and pain churning inside her. Every word they spoke made her feel they not only disrespected her, but everything she stood for. Gloria sat upright in the cramped car, her eyes fixed out the window, watching everything pass by coldly. The view outside was nothing special. Empty streets of Savannah, the streetlights flickering weakly in the dark night. Everything seemed as blurry as what was happening to her. She couldn't help but feel she was being pulled into a nightmare, but at the same time she also felt a sense of resilience rising within her. They could tighten the cuffs on her, they could push her into this car, but they couldn't tighten the freedom inside her. She was Gloria, a person who had witnessed enough suffering from illness, from life and death. She had faced fear in the emergency room, but never had she felt fear like this. Because this fear wasn't physical pain, but the transformation of herself. The deceit that society was imposing on her, simply because of her skin color. The car's engine hummed steadily like the ticking of a countdown clock. Gloria couldn't help but think of those who would have to continue living in this injustice if she did nothing. She knew that what was happening wasn't just affecting her, but others too. Those who had also been disregarded, trampled upon simply because of the color of their skin. If she didn't do something to change it, everything would remain the same forever. The car stopped in front of the police station. The car door opened and Gloria was shoved out. She stepped out of the car, the eyes around her all turned toward her. Suspicious looks, murmurs, but she didn't care. She walked with determination, her eyes not leaving those who stood watching. They looked at her, but she looked back at them as if to tell them she would not bow her head. She was not a loser. She was led into the police station where the cold neon lights illuminated every corner of the office. Everything here exuded an ominous, chilly feeling, as though justice no longer resided in this place. The chief officer stepped forward, his face smug. "We'll deal with you soon enough," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Gloria didn't respond. She merely stared at him in silence coldly. In her mind, the fire of anger still raged. Everything they did to her wasn't just a personal mistake. It was a monumental error against society as a whole, and Gloria would be the one to make them pay for it. She would not remain silent. She would not let them think they could easily destroy her life without facing consequences, because they didn't know they were making a huge mistake, a mistake that couldn't be undone. As the door of the police station closed behind her, it wasn't the end, but the beginning of a new battle, a battle Gloria would never back down from. The ride to the police station was far from comfortable. Each wheel rolling on the road felt like it was striking Gloria's heart, as if each beat echoed within her chest. She sat silently in the patrol car, the pain not coming from the handcuffs biting into her wrists, but from the humiliation she was enduring. This shame wasn't physical torment, it was the deception, the deep offense society had imposed upon her just because of her skin color. But in that darkness, Gloria knew she wasn't alone. A crucial phone call had been made. Walter, her father, a seasoned former FBI agent who had spent his life fighting against corruption and abuse of power, had begun to take action. He was not one to wait. He was the one who changed the game. And when he arrived, nothing would ever be the same again. They would realize they had made a huge mistake, a mistake they couldn't easily ignore. Gloria could feel the stillness from outside, but inside her, everything was boiling. She sat up straight, motionless, but her mind was constantly racing. Every moment in this car dragged her back to painful memories, to the times she fought to save others' lives, but never before had she felt she had to fight for herself like this. This feeling, the sensation of being unable to breathe, the sense that everything was against her, made her realize that she herself had to rise because if she didn't, no one else would. Outside, the night still enveloped the city, but inside the police station, the atmosphere began to change. Gloria knew that when Walter arrived, nothing would be the same. He was the one who could make the entire system halt, look at itself, and face the truth. Throughout his career, Walter had dealt with abusers of power, those who thought they could escape their wrongdoings, but he never gave up. And now he wouldn't let his daughter suffer another day. When the patrol car finally stopped in front of the station, Gloria stepped out. Though everything was still a blur in her mind, she couldn't ignore the coldness in the air. The door of the police station seemed like a threshold into the darkness she had to cross, but she didn't flinch. She stood tall, refusing to let the gazes of the officers inside shake her resolve. The chief officer stepped forward, his face unyielding. He didn't care about her reasons, the truth, or her emotions. To him, she was just a problem to be solved, but Gloria, with her cold stare, didn't miss a single moment to assert that she was not one to be easily subdued. Meanwhile, out there, Walter had already begun to act. His name was a reminder to all those who abused their power that they couldn't hide forever. As a former FBI agent, he had solved hundreds of complex cases, but none had ever felt like this. This wasn't just about justice for his daughter. It was about justice for all those who had suffered from racism and the abuse of power. Walter had spent his life fighting for the nameless. But this time, this fight was for him and his daughter, Walter. "I need you here immediately." Gloria's voice echoed on the phone without the slightest tremor. "Justice needs you." Walter only needed to hear those words. He knew his daughter was in an unimaginable situation, and he couldn't sit idly by while she endured it. A call was made, and then silence filled the police station. Gloria couldn't help but feel a storm was approaching. These officers didn't know that they weren't facing an ordinary woman, but a fury that could topple everything they had ever believed was right. Walter had prepared for this moment for a long time, and when he arrived, no one among these abusers of power would be able to sit still. When he arrived, everything would change. Just a name that could call out every mistake, every act of discrimination. Walter Tate, once a nightmare for criminals for many years, would now be the one to bring justice for his daughter. Gloria didn't need to say anything more. She had already said everything she needed through her gaze and her determined look. She was not one to be easily subdued. And when Walter arrived, she would stand firm, because this fight wasn't just hers. It was for everyone who had suffered from injustice in this society. Tonight, everything would change. When the door of the police station opened, a cold gust of wind swept in. Not because the air was cold, but because of the presence of a man who entered as if he were a storm about to break. Walter Tate was no stranger to the officers. He was a former FBI agent with years of experience dealing with abusers of power, and his reputation made many wary. The moment he stepped through the door, the atmosphere in the station changed completely. The officers who had been sitting or standing smugly suddenly felt the tension creeping into the air. Walter didn't need to shout or show anger. Each of his steps was a powerful declaration, not only because he was Gloria's father, but because he understood the cost of justice. His gaze was cold but filled with resolve. He didn't look at the officers. He simply walked straight toward the chief officer's desk, the one he knew would have to face the storm he was about to bring. Gloria stood silently beside her father, her eyes never leaving him. She knew that she didn't need to do anything anymore. Everything had already been prepared by Walter, and his intervention would be the turning point in this story. For him, justice was not just a word or an abstract concept, but something he had fought his entire life to protect. Today, he would not let anyone, be it a police officer or any agency, bend the values that he and his daughter represented. Walter stopped in front of the chief officer's desk, a man with an unpleasant demeanor and an arrogant attitude. His eyes didn't blink, and his voice resonated soft, but carrying an undeniable strength. "You will have to explain very clearly what happened to my daughter tonight." Walter said each word flowing from his mouth with the utmost seriousness and respect. "I don't care about the reasons you offer. What I care about is the truth and justice." And the chief officer, though trying to maintain a calm appearance, could be seen starting to show signs of nervousness in his eyes. Everything was changing too quickly, and it seemed like he was beginning to realize that his arrogance was being tested. Walter was not a man who would tolerate empty explanations. He was someone who stood up and fought for what was right. But before the chief officer could respond, Walter continued, "What you've done to my daughter is an infringement of a human being's rights, and you cannot continue to overlook these actions." The tension in the room increased as other officers began to realize that Walter wasn't just talking about a simple incident. He was someone who could expose the dark truths they had tried to hide, and he was ready to bring their entire careers into the light. The officers in the room couldn't help but feel the pressure mounting on them. What they thought would be a simple case had now turned into a legal battle they couldn't predict the outcome of. "You think you can escape this by turning a blind eye?" Walter asked, his voice still calm but carrying a clear threat. "Just because you have power and can use it to overpower others doesn't mean you will escape responsibility when you are wrong." A heavy moment of silence passed in the room. The officers could no longer deny that Walter was not just Gloria's father. He was an influential figure, someone who had fought against abusers of power for years. His reputation made them wary. But it was the calm and decisiveness in his words that made them truly fearful. Walter didn't need to yell or threaten with force. Just his presence had already changed everything. Walter seemed to sense the hesitation from those around him, and he continued, "This is not a game, and what you've done is not just a personal mistake. This is a violation of human rights, and I will not let this go as if it never happened." The chief officer's gaze was no longer smug. He began to realize that everything he had built over the years could come crumbling down tonight. The other officers in the room could no longer keep up their indifferent facade. They began to sense that they were in a very difficult position where their actions could no longer avoid scrutiny. Walter scanned the room slowly, not in a rush, not hurried. "You may feel safe in this system, but I assure you this system will not protect you when the truth comes to light." He didn't need to say anything more. Everyone in the room understood clearly. A legal storm was coming, and Walter was leading it. Walter was not a man who got angry or rash. He was calm, but that calmness carried a terrifying power. He stood there in the middle of the police station like a witness of justice, and with every word he made, everyone in the room realized that justice would never succumb to the abuse of power. Walter Tate's presence was not just an intervention to protect his daughter, but a warning to all those who thought they could abuse their power without consequence. Today, Walter would not only be the father protecting Gloria, he would be the one to awaken the conscience of a system that had been dark and corrupt for far too long. Walter was not just leading this fight for his daughter, but for all those who had been oppressed, those without a voice in this society. And once he started, no one could stop his path. The silence in the police station had been completely shattered since Walter Tate walked in. But now everything was not just about his words. The legal storm he had warned about had started to rise, and the officers in the station could feel the shift in the atmosphere. What they thought would be hidden in the dark was starting to come to light. With the help of federal agents, evidence of misconduct within the Savannah Police Department was quickly collected. Security camera footage, phone call recordings, and critical documents related to civil rights violations were extracted. The agents were no longer working quietly in the investigation room, but began taking decisive actions to bring everything into the open. They were not just focusing on the officers' actions during Gloria's arrest, but expanding the investigation into broader issues related to abuse of power within the police force. Gloria had become a symbol not only of a personal struggle, but of a movement fighting against racism and the abuse of power by law enforcement agencies. Although she was the victim in this story, her fight had reached others and sparked an inevitable wave of change. One day after Walter's intervention, federal agents searched the police department's offices, gathering documents about past lawsuits and internal investigations that had been mishandled. These papers contained information about the officers' wrongdoing, human rights violations they had deliberately ignored or concealed. The agents discovered that many similar incidents to Gloria's had happened before, but no one had spoken out, and no one had the power to demand an investigation. The security footage documenting the actions of the officers during Gloria's arrest was made public. It clearly showed the lack of professionalism, abuse of power, and blatant racism that Gloria endured. These videos were not only proof of severe violations, but also a powerful indictment of the system that had protected the misconduct of those in power. Every frame, but every word, or every action of the officers involved in the incident served as a tight brick in the wall of truth, exposing the mistakes of those who thought they could escape accountability. Gloria's story was no longer just an isolated incident. It had become a symbol of the relentless struggle against injustice, against those who wield power to oppress others. It was a fight for all those who had been ignored by the justice system, those who had been dismissed because of their skin color, those who had no voice in society. Gloria was no longer just a nurse, not just a woman wrongfully arrested, but she had become a warrior, a symbol of strength and perseverance. The story of Gloria began spreading rapidly across the internet. Posts, videos, and articles were shared continuously, capturing the attention of the public. Not only in Savannah, but nationwide discussions about racism and abuse of power flourished. Many human rights organizations reached out to Gloria, offering support and deep empathy. Protests began to break out in many places, from large cities to small towns, where people gathered to strongly oppose the wrongdoings of the police. This was a movement not just for one person, but for all those who had been oppressed and silenced. Legal organizations also began to re-examine cases that had been forgotten, cases where the victims lacked the power to fight back. Human rights lawyers began gathering evidence and planning to file lawsuits against the Savannah Police Department. They not only wanted to expose the actions of the officers, but also aimed to change the system, reform how law enforcement handled issues of racism and power abuse. For Gloria, she was no longer just a victim in this story. She had become an integral part of a larger fight. She had stood up, faced humiliation and pain, but now she was no longer fighting alone. She had the support of Walter, the community, and people in power who were ready to expose the dark secrets of the system. But for her, the most important thing was that she had proven to herself and to others that nothing could defeat the resilience of a person who was willing to stand up for the truth. The arrival of federal agents, along with the public release of the incriminating evidence, was just the beginning of a far-reaching investigation. As days passed, the investigations and public discussions became even stronger. Gloria had become a symbol, not just in the fight for justice, but as a sign that no one, regardless of who they were, could stand above the law, and no one could ignore human rights violations simply because they held power. Change had begun, and Gloria knew that while the road ahead was long, she would never walk it alone again. She had opened a door, and no one could close it now. Gloria Smith's story had grown beyond a personal incident. What began as a single encounter with injustice in a small pharmacy had turned into a powerful wave, sweeping millions of hearts and sparking a broader, deeper struggle. Her life was no longer just hers alone. She had become a symbol of the fight for all those who had been ignored by the system, those who had been rendered invisible just because they lacked power. And this was not limited to one city, one state. It had become a national issue. Protests began to erupt everywhere. People gathered in big cities, small towns, from quiet suburban areas to busy urban centers. They carried with them a long-held anger, a frustration nurtured over years of being silenced by excuses, empty answers, and the terrifying silence of those responsible. Gloria became the face of these protests, not because she craved attention, but because her story was the story of all those who had been treated unfairly. In the weeks following the arrest, as videos of the incident spread widely on social media, the community began to come together, standing up against racism and abuse of power. The protests were no longer confined to the local area. From New York, Los Angeles to Chicago, and even in small towns in the South where incidents like this happened every day without anyone noticing. Protesters chanted slogans, "Justice for Gloria," a slogan that demanded justice not just for one person, but for all the victims of racism and police violence. Gloria was not someone who liked standing in front of crowds. She was a modest woman, a nurse for many years caring for the sick and those in need of help. But now she was no longer just a nurse. She had become the voice for the voiceless. She continued fighting not just for herself, but for all those who could not stand up against injustice. With the support of Walter, her father, a highly influential figure in the community, they continued to work tirelessly. Walter, who had spent his life fighting against corruption and protecting the powerless, was now leading this fight. He was not just Gloria's father, but also her mentor, guiding her through this difficult battle. This fight was not just about one family. It was part of a larger struggle, a campaign to reclaim justice for millions of others. Stories from all over began to be shared. People mistreated by the police, those wrongfully arrested, those beaten, simply because they belonged to a different race. These stories were no longer hidden. Those who had suffered in silence began to speak out. And Gloria, with the resilience of a woman willing to stand up when oppressed, had sparked a powerful wave. Not only the public, but also human rights organizations, lawyers, politicians, and many social communities began to join in this fight. Organizations such as the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, started voicing their support for Gloria, and celebrities like movie stars, athletes, and social activists also shared her story. The international community also took notice of the case. From the United Nations to international human rights organizations, all condemned the actions of the police and called for a change in law enforcement practices, especially regarding issues of racism and abuse of power. With the rapid change in circumstances, the government had to take action. Widespread investigations began not only at the Savannah Police Department, but also extended to other agencies. The officers involved in Gloria's case, particularly Rick Coleman and David Miller, faced criticism not only from the community, but also from authorities. Continuous inspections and investigations were conducted, and old cases that had been neglected were now being revived and subjected to scrutiny from the competent authorities. However, Gloria's struggle didn't stop with seeking justice for herself. She knew that her larger goal was to change the system. She didn't want to just demand justice for the victims of racism and police violence. She wanted these systems no longer to exist. She wanted no one else to suffer what she had been through. With strong support from the community and organizations, Gloria decided to participate in a legal reform campaign. She began meeting with politicians, lawyers, and people in power, pushing for changes in the law to ensure the rights of all those oppressed and abused. She and Walter participated in workshops and meetings with community groups to create a long-term strategy, not just to win a lawsuit, but to bring about profound and lasting change. Gloria's story, initially just an accident, had now become the driving force for a revolution in how the justice system operated. Her struggle had rekindled the faith in those who had been ignored for too long, those who had lost hope in a just society. Gloria and Walter knew that this fight wasn't a short-term battle, but a long and difficult journey. But they also knew that if everyone stood up and didn't give up, nothing was impossible to change. In the end, everything could change, but only when someone dared to stand up. And Gloria did just that. She stood up and changed not only herself, but an entire generation. In a short period of time, Gloria's story had spread to the point where no one could ignore it. From an ordinary woman, she had become the symbol of the fight for justice and equality. She didn't only face the injustice done to herself, but she stood up for all those who have and are still suffering from racism, oppression, and abuse of power. After all the pain, humiliation, and despair, Gloria was no longer someone who just accepted her fate. She was the one who dared to stand up, who dared to confront everything. On a beautiful day, not long after her case had been brought to light and shocked the entire nation, Gloria stood before a crowd at a large protest in downtown Savannah. Cheers erupted as she stepped up to the podium, looking at the faces waiting for her words. The crowd was waiting for words that could help them find a ray of hope in a world full of discrimination and injustice. Gloria was ready. She was not afraid. What she had gone through was not an easy lesson, but it had forged an unbreakable strength within her. She had stood firm when oppressed and now standing before those who empathize with her. She knew she was not just representing one individual, but all victims of injustice in society. I don't want to just hear apologies. Gloria began, her voice resonating through the tense air of the crowd. I don't need empty promises. I don't need hollow sympathy. I want real change. Change that doesn't just come from words, but from action, from irreversible decisions, from bold steps to protect the rights of all those who are treated unfairly. The crowd erupted into applause and chants. Gloria's words ignited a fire in the hearts of everyone present. She wasn't speaking just for herself, but for all those who had been forgotten for too long. She was no longer a helpless victim. She was standing up, speaking the truth, and she was ready to change the world. Have you ever felt like I have, Gloria continued, the feeling of being judged wrongly, just because you're different, the feeling of being ostracized, being seen as someone unworthy of being treated like others simply because of your skin color? I've lived with that all my life, and I won't accept it anymore. None of us can remain silent while injustice continues like this. Her words weren't just complaints, they were a call to action. Each word she uttered struck the hearts of those listening. She wasn't just standing up against racism. She was issuing a call for society to face itself, to confront the issues that had been hidden for too long. This wasn't the time to sit back and wait for change. It was the time to act, to make decisions, Gloria continued. I've endured so much, but not just me. How many others have been and are being crushed by this system? How many people have never had the chance to speak out, to fight against oppression, to reclaim their rights? They too deserve change. They deserve justice, and we will do that. We will stand up, the crowd roared, clapping nonstop. Gloria conveyed her message with the power of truth, with the perseverance of someone who would never give up. Every word she said carried an undeniable weight. She wasn't just speaking her emotions. She had become the voice for all those who had been oppressed. In that crowd, some began to cry. Those who had been overlooked and oppressed and seen as unimportant now felt as if they had been acknowledged. Gloria had given them hope, faith in themselves, and in the power of change. She had shown them that no matter how much the system tried to silence them, they could still stand up and fight. This is the time for us to decide. No one can change this world for us. Only we can do that. Stand up, demand, change, fight so that justice is not just a word in a book. We must prove that everyone has the right to live equally, regardless of skin color, origin, or ethnicity. Her words didn't just ignite hope in the hearts of the protesters. They created a massive wave in the community, opening up opportunities for real change. Gloria had not only asked for justice for herself, but had become the leader of a movement fighting for equality and social justice. When she finished speaking, the crowd did not stop applauding. They didn't even want Gloria to leave the podium. It was an emotional moment, a moment where everyone felt that finally people like Gloria were no longer forgotten in the darkness. They not only had the right to live equally, but they also had the right to speak the truth and demand change. Gloria stood there not needing to say anything more. She knew that what she had already said was enough to create a powerful movement. She was not only fighting for herself, but for all those who were being treated unfairly, and she knew this fight had only just begun. But no matter what, she would always stand firm. "We will not give up," Gloria whispered into the wind. "For justice, for all those who have been silent, for all those who will continue to fight." The crowd outside continued to clap, never stopping, and Gloria's story would continue as a blazing fire in the hearts of all those searching for justice, searching for change. Gloria Smith's story had touched the very soul of society. It was no longer just a personal incident. It had become a call to awakening for all those who had endured injustice, racism, and abuse of power. As the event attracted nationwide attention, a wave of change began to spread, not just within the community, but also within local government. The corrupt officers, the ones who had directly harmed Gloria, now had to face the consequences of their actions. Rick Coleman and David Miller, the officers who had once believed they could not be touched, were suspended while an investigation was carried out to verify their misconduct. This was a big step, but it was only the beginning of a larger reform within the enforcement agencies. Federal agents got involved. Extensive investigations were carried out, not only focusing on the two officers, but also expanding to review similar cases from the past. Other officers, those who had previously abused their power, began to face the consequences of their actions. The chief of police and other authorities within the department were also under scrutiny. No one could be sure they would not be held accountable for their negligence and their enabling of the wrongful actions of the officers under their command. Locally, following strong calls from the community and civil rights organizations, new policies were introduced. One of the most significant changes was the reform of police procedures when interacting with citizens. Law enforcement agencies began applying stricter regulations for handling situations involving suspicion or conflict, requiring officers to have valid reasons before intervening in people's lives. New training programs were rolled out, focusing on teaching police officers how to handle situations more reasonably and fairly. Lessons on empathy, how to deal with diverse and sensitive communities were included in the official training curriculum. Policies on racism were also reviewed and adjusted to ensure that those enforcing the law were working not just for the law, but for social justice. Each officer was required to undergo training on human rights and the things to avoid when interacting with the public. Exams were held to assess their awareness and behavior in complex situations. While these changes brought hope, a big question remained: would this change last, or was it just a temporary reaction to public pressure? Would the police officers actually change the way they worked, or would they simply return to their old habits once the public's attention faded? This wasn't just an issue about regulations and training. It was a matter of culture within law enforcement. This was the question that Gloria and those fighting with her constantly worried about. They knew that changing a long-standing system wasn't something that could be done overnight. Gloria didn't just want to see changes on paper. She wanted to see real change, from how the police treated the people to how the legal system operated. She understood that while small changes might create positive signs, A real revolution would only happen when those changes were sustained and developed over time. So along with Walter, her father Gloria continued to fight. She participated in meetings, met with political leaders, and tirelessly pushed the relevant authorities to commit to long-term changes. She wanted to ensure that the new policies were not just a temporary strategy, but a solid step in rebuilding the community's trust in the justice system. She called for change not just from the police, but from government officials and those in power. She knew that without a comprehensive and decisive change at all her efforts, her families, and everyone who had joined this struggle would be meaningless. Gloria's story wasn't just about a woman abused by power. It was the story of millions who had been pushed into the shadows of discrimination and oppression. It was a powerful reminder that change never comes easily. But if we have enough perseverance, if we have the strength to keep standing up, then in the end, we will succeed. Gloria knew she couldn't change the world alone, but she believed that if everyone joined together, we could create a more just society. Each day, as small changes began to take place, Gloria felt a renewed sense of hope. But she also understood that the fight had never been easy, and there would never be a stopping point. This was a battle not just for justice for one individual, but to reclaim the right to live and the freedom for all those who had been oppressed. Change would come, but it would come from the relentless efforts of everyone. Gloria stood firm, continuing the fight, continuing to hope. And she knew that no matter how great the challenges, she would never give up for. She had found a strength greater than any difficulty, faith in justice and in her own ability. The bright lights of camera flashes and the noise of continuous questions from reporters surrounded Gloria and Walter as they entered the press room. This scene was truly different from what they had imagined. Not long ago, Gloria had been just a woman wrongfully detained, but now she had become the symbol of the fight against racism and abuse of power in the justice system. Walter walked beside her, strong and steady, like a wall standing between her and the outside world. The crowd of reporters, cameras, and recorders were ready to capture every word, every expression from her. Gloria knew all eyes were on her, not because she wanted attention, but because she wanted to make people look at the truth, to confront what had actually happened. When they stepped up to the podium, Gloria's gaze swept over the crowd, but she didn't allow herself to be distracted. She understood that this fight was no longer just hers. It was a fight for all those who had endured injustice, and she had to speak for them. When the first reporter spoke, the atmosphere grew more intense than ever. They began asking about her case, her feelings about being arrested and the trauma she had endured. Gloria took a deep breath, her eyes bright with determination, and then she spoke. "I'm not here to accept apologies." She said each word gentle yet firm. "Apologies cannot erase what has happened, cannot undo what I've been through. I don't want to hear empty promises. What I need is real change that can prevent the same thing from happening to others." The room fell silent for a moment. The reporters, used to political statements and well-prepared apologies, could now sense the shift in Gloria's tone. She was no longer the woman who had been hurt. She was a warrior, a leader in the fight for justice. Walter stood beside her without a word, but his gaze said it all. He looked toward the local officials, those who had made the wrong decisions, and he knew that today would be an important day in history. A day not just of personal change, but the beginning of a revolution in the policies of public institutions. Gloria continued, "It's not just me, but millions of others who have suffered from discrimination, abuse of power, and injustice. These people don't have the power I do. They don't have the chance to speak out. My story is not the only one. This is the story of everyone who has been pushed to the margins by the system. I want to see change not in words but in action." Everyone was silent, and then a quiet sense of understanding spread throughout the room. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was representing a greater voice, a wave demanding justice, not just today but for many years to come. Gloria emphasized another crucial point. We can't just blame a few individuals. Change has to come from the entire system. There must be real reforms in how public institutions operate. Police officers who break the law cannot be sheltered. And policies, citizens' rights regulations need to be reviewed to ensure fairness for everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from. Her words were not just a request, they were a call for structural change. She wasn't just calling for change in individuals, but in an entire system that had existed for too long, a system that sometimes had forgotten its original purpose, protecting and serving everyone equally and fairly. The reporters continued to press, but no one dared interrupt her anymore. The story had gone beyond the boundaries of a personal case. This was the story of society, of the fundamental values every country must protect. Gloria stood firm, not just because she wanted to hear apologies. She stood firm to demand real change. She knew that an apology couldn't heal her, couldn't erase the trauma she had suffered. But real change, a change in thought and action, that was what she needed. With the support of Walter, Gloria continued to fight not only for herself, but for all those pushed aside by society, for all those who had and were still enduring racism, abuse of power, and injustice. She would never want people like her to remain silent, to accept humiliation, to live in the shadow of prejudice. Reporters began asking about the changes Gloria wanted to see. She answered without hesitation. First, we need to review how public institutions handle situations involving citizens, especially those from vulnerable communities. I want to see a legal system where every citizen is treated equally without discrimination based on race, color, or gender. Second, I want to see real transparency. Every action of the police, every decision regarding arrests, investigations must be publicly supervised. And finally, I want to see a change in how we educate future generations of police officers and public servants so they better understand citizens' rights and respect the diversity within the community. Each answer Gloria gave wasn't just a demand. It was a clear strategy to bring a society back to the values of justice it should have. It was a fight not only for her own rights, but for the rights of the entire community, for the entire society. As the press conference concluded, Gloria didn't feel proud of herself. She felt like she was on the right path. This was just a small step in a long journey, but she knew that with persistence and determination, change was not far away. "We've begun," she said quietly to Walter, who was standing beside her. "But this is just the beginning. We have to keep fighting, not just for me, but for all those who haven't had the chance to speak out." Walter nodded, his eyes shining with belief. "Yes, Gloria, they won't be able to put out this fire, and this time we'll win." Gloria's story was not just a personal victory, but a quiet yet determined revolution. It sparked a wave of change where the oppressed, those who had been looked down upon, now found strength in speaking up and fighting for themselves and those around them. The tears, the pain she had endured were not just a personal burden, but the event that sparked a movement demanding justice. Since Gloria stood firm against injustice, since she refused to bow to those oppressions, her story had become a flame lighting up those living in the darkness of prejudice and stagnation. Protests and confrontations between communities and authorities became a familiar image. Gloria was not just a symbol of resilience. She was proof that one person could change an entire system, armed only with the power of determination and courage. Her courage had ignited a spark of hope for those who had long endured racism, indifference from the public system, and the wounds in their hearts, like a torch in the dark. Gloria's story showed them that if one woman oppressed and treated unjustly could stand up and fight, then anyone among them could do the same. Gloria knew that change was not a short race, but a long journey. A personal victory could not change the entire system, but it could be the starting point for greater strides. Looking at the transformation in the community, she understood that what mattered was not just winning a case or a legal decision. What mattered was showing people that they could change their own future. She realized that courage, standing up and fighting, couldn't always bring immediate results, but it created space for others to see they were not alone. It sparked a belief that justice could prevail, that one person was never too small to make a difference. Gloria's stand proved that justice is not something handed to you. It is something you must demand and protect. In everyday life, people like Gloria were often considered invisible, but when she stepped out of the shadows and fought for herself, she showed the world that fairness is a basic human right and no one can take it away. This not only changed her life, but also changed how people viewed those pushed to the margins of society. Gloria's courage was also an important lesson for the next generation. Young people, especially those from minority communities, could now look to her story and see that they too had the right to stand up. They learned they didn't have to suffer in silence. They had the right to fight for truth and justice. She had given them a role model for strength, for maintaining dignity, and for protecting their rights even when life sometimes pushed them into seemingly impossible situations. Gloria wasn't just fighting for herself, but for all those who had been silenced, for those who had never had the opportunity to speak out. For her, every woman, every man, every child being pushed out of society deserved to be treated fairly. Her stand, though it began with a small event, had become a massive movement. She had become the representative for millions who had no voice, and in every word she spoke, in every steady step she took, the oppressed could feel hope. After the legal battle, Gloria and those who stood with her did not stop. They continued to find ways to change the entire system, ensuring that racism would no longer be a part of society. It was a struggle with no clear endpoint, but it was always continued through small actions, through gradual shifts in the mindset and perspectives of the community. Gloria was not only a strong woman, but she was a trailblazer, lighting the path for future generations. But Gloria also understood that the final victory wasn't an end, but the beginning of a long journey. This fight couldn't depend on one individual. It needed the participation of everyone from the government to social organizations to the community. And only when each citizen, every person begins to question justice, when each person feels that justice is theirs, will society truly change. Gloria's story, therefore, it wasn't just about the victory of one woman. It was the story of the power of standing up and how small but decisive actions could change an entire system. Those who were oppressed, those who had been silent, now knew they could change everything if they dared to stand up, dared to speak out, and fought for justice. Gloria was not just a symbol of courage, but also an endless source of inspiration for those yearning for a fairer world. Her story will continue to be told not just for what she went through, but for what she brought to society. A powerful message about human rights and the indomitable spirit in the fight for justice. Gloria stood firm in the glaring light of recognition. It wasn't just the recognition from family and friends, but from the entire community, from those who had never thought they could speak up, from those who had lived in the shadows of racism and oppression for far too long. She had become the symbol for the powerless, for those who had been pushed aside by the system, for those who had and were still enduring injustice they could no longer tolerate. As Gloria's story spread widely, she was no longer just the woman who had been wrongfully detained. She had become the symbol of a quiet yet powerful revolution. Gloria had created an undeniable impact, a call for all those who had been overlooked in society to rise up and demand justice. Protests became more frequent and widespread, not only in Savannah, but in cities large and small, from north to south, from east to west. Thousands of people took to the streets, holding banners, demanding rights, justice, and equality. Hashtags spread quickly on social media, linked with Gloria's story, and people began to find strength in standing up and fighting, finding hope in life after years of quiet suffering. She wasn't just a victim of racism, she was an inspiration for millions who had no voice. Gloria was the model of someone who fought tirelessly even when the world outside tried to suffocate her voice. Her resilience made everyone realize that no one, no matter who they were, what they did, or where they lived, should be treated unfairly because of their skin color or background. When her story was retold, no one could deny that it had opened a new chapter in the fight against racism. She wasn't just demanding justice for herself, but for all those like her, those who faced judgment and discrimination that no one saw. More importantly, she had sparked a movement, a wave that could not be extinguished because it was not just her fight. It was the fight of all those who had and were still living in the shadows of discrimination. When the reporters asked her about the feeling of becoming a symbol for the movement, Gloria simply smiled and replied, "What I want is for no one to have to endure what I've gone through. I'm not special. I'm just one of millions of people fighting for their rights. But if my story can change something, if it can inspire someone to stand up, then I've achieved my purpose." That simple answer spoke volumes. Gloria wasn't seeking fame or admiration. What she wanted was change. She wanted people not just in the United States, but across the world to understand that racism and the abuse of power were unacceptable, and no one had the right to strip anyone of their justice. Each protest, each march carried a powerful message. We can't stay silent in the face of injustice. People began to stand up and say, "We will not accept racism anymore." And slogans like "Black Lives Matter," "End Police Brutality," and "Justice for Gloria" echoed everywhere from small neighborhoods to large squares. The protests weren't just expressions of dissatisfaction, but a manifestation of hope that one day everyone would be treated equally. Gloria knew her struggle couldn't end immediately, but she had started a movement that could not be extinguished. She understood that changing a system takes time, but with enough persistence and determination, change would come, and what she had done, what she had fought for, would never be forgotten. A month later, a major conference was held in Washington, D.C., about changes in policies and laws concerning citizens' rights and how to reform public institutions. The event organizers invited Gloria to speak as the keynote speaker. As she stepped up to the podium, her gaze wasn't just directed at the officials, but at the people from everywhere. Those who had found strength in her story. Gloria had not only inspired those closest to her, but had changed the way an entire country viewed the issue of racism. Her story wasn't just hers. It was the story of millions who had been silenced, who had suffered in the shadows, and now they could stand up. Since Gloria's story started being shared, gradual changes were happening in the government and the community. Public institutions, those responsible for protecting citizens' rights, now had to answer to justice. The police officers involved in her case had to face the consequences, and not just them, but the entire system was now under tighter scrutiny than ever before. Gloria felt that change not just through legal decisions, but through the way society was gradually recognizing and acknowledging the injustice that had occurred. It was a victory not just for an individual, but for an entire community. She knew there was still much to be done, but she also knew that change is never easy, and the small steps taken today would lay the foundation for greater changes in the future. And in the end, Gloria realized that it was her stand, her story that had brought a new hope to those who had lost it. A hope that justice could be served, that everyone, no matter who they were, had the right to live in a fair and equal society. And that was the echo of justice that she and people like her truly deserved. Gloria's story was not just a personal journey, but a symbol of the relentless fight for justice and equality. After everything, the tears, the sleepless nights, the hard battles with a system that was sometimes unjust, Gloria had not only changed her own life, but had changed an entire community, an entire nation. She was not just a victim of racism, she was a warrior in the battle against injustice. And that was just the beginning. As investigations began to yield conclusions, Gloria not only received recognition from the authorities, but also from the entire community. The officers who had committed crimes were suspended, and protests erupted across the country, demanding real change in the way public institutions operated. But Gloria knew that this change was not the end. It was a sign of a beginning. Her fight did not stop when those who had caused the injustice were punished. Gloria understood that our society couldn't rely solely on isolated cases to bring change. She had witnessed the power of unity, of people who were no longer afraid to stand up for their rights. The protests, the marches soaked with sweat and tears had created echoes that could not be silenced. But the most important thing was that Gloria had brought a message to all those who had been living under the shadow of racism, those who had been suffocated by the system, that they were not alone. Gloria was living proof that one person could change an entire system if they dared to stand up and speak the truth. With the help of social organizations, civil rights lawyers, Gloria continued to fight not just for herself, but for all those who had been abandoned. Every day she received gratitude from those who could not stand up for themselves. She was their source of inspiration, the torch that would light the way for those wanting to change and demand justice. Gloria's story continued to be told in workshops and classrooms about civil rights and in protests for equality. She was not just a winner in a personal battle, but the creator of a movement. That movement had ignited the flame of justice, erasing the shadows of racism that had persisted for too long. But Gloria didn't forget that her journey had only just begun. She knew that this fight would not stop. Each step she took would lead to new challenges, new opponents. The system doesn't change overnight, and lasting change requires more than just one story. It requires every individual in society to understand that justice is not a given. It must be fought for and protected every day. Gloria had taken the first steps toward real change in local governance, demanding that public institutions uphold justice, not just in high-profile cases, but in every small situation. She began participating in judicial reform seminars, joining civil rights organizations where she could amplify the voices of those who had been ignored. And most importantly, Gloria began working with the younger generations to help them understand that only when they stand up can their voices create change. Gloria's journey is an ongoing struggle for a better world where everyone can live in equality and respect. But it is not just her, it is all of us, those with conscience, those who desire justice. Her story is a reminder of the power of unity, the strength of one person when they are no longer afraid to face injustice. This story has ended, but it's not the end for Gloria, and it's not the end of this fight. It is the beginning, a new step forward for all those who dare to stand up, dare to fight for justice. And this will never end. Remember, justice will always stand with the truth, and if you want a just society, don't hesitate to stand up. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss powerful stories like this. The story never ends and justice continues its journey.